great. It's pretty fantastic. Now, alcohol disrupts the architecture, the quality of your sleep. You can fall asleep, but the sleep you get is not restorative. And the first part of your night when you sleep is really for repair of the body, growth hormone release, et cetera. The second half is when two things happen. One is you tend to have dreams that are very emotionally laden, but you are paralyzed. You have sleep atonia. You can't move. And it's a kind of trauma therapy. You actually, if you ever had like a disturbing interaction or something's bothering you, if you get a few nights good sleep, you're like, okay, like it's like water under the bridge. If you don't, people tend to kind of maintain the emotional load of things. Now, the sleep atonia is kind of interesting. Has anyone here ever woken up and you were still paralyzed?
Yeah.
And then
Happens to my wife. It's terrifying.
Yeah. Well, it happens more often to cannabis users, but it's not uncommon for non-cannabis users too. So you wake up and it's just like you kind of jolt awake. It's pretty terrifying actually to be wide awake, but you can't move. But that's what it's like in that second half of the night of sleep. If you drink alcohol, you tend to screw up the first part of the night of sleep. And so the physical repair doesn't happen as well. Now, look, I'm not saying like you can never have a glass of wine or a cocktail or something. It depends on how many other healthy things you're doing and how many other unhealthy things. This is important.
Yeah.
So, if you were to be really strict, you'd say the data point to the fact that no alcohol is better for your immediate and long-term health than any alcohol. And people say, well, red wine's good. And in these blue zones where people live to be 110, they're doing a lot of other things too. The reality is the resveratrol in red wine, you'd have to drink so much red wine in order to get the resveratrol. You'd be drinking all day. It's just that argument is feeble. But if you're going to drink, you can probably have 2 drinks, maybe 3 per week. No problem. No problem.
Total drinks per week.
Per week. But if you're going to drink more than that, and I'm not, listen, I don't tell people what to do. I just say, but know what you're doing, right?
Yeah.
If you're going to do that, then you probably want to make some effort to do other things right. For instance, I would hope that people are avoiding hard drugs like cocaine and amphetamine. Yeah. Why? Because they lead to huge increases in dopamine that basically reward only one thing: cocaine and amphetamine. And over time, everything else feels a little weak in comparison, right? It's an extreme experience that you didn't really have to earn, right? There's nothing earned. And so then everything else seems a little bit weak. And so cocaine and amphetamine are very, very bad. And opioids are just really bad. And the fentanyl thing now is super scary, where young people, old people are just dying. So let's just like put those in heroin. Let's just put those in a category of like, let's not even entertain. There are people.
Adderall's in that thing too?
Well, Adderall, it's crazy. Whenever I come to New York, and whenever I run into the investment banker types, especially the young guys, like Adderall is big out here.
Yeah.
Big, big, big. And
New York City's Adderall culture. Like, not even just, it's any job at an office, you're probably doing Adderall.
Yeah, it's the cocaine, it's prescription cocaine, basically. Yeah, I am, unless you have clinically diagnosed ADHD, I would, steer clear of Adderall, Vyvanse, even modafinil. Occasional use of modafinil, which was developed for narcolepsy and things like that. Maybe for certain, modafinil is very expensive, prohibitively expensive for most people. There are certain supplements that work not as well, but things like alpha GPC, which are safer, 300 milligrams of alpha GPC. But listen, I have a colleague who won a Nobel Prize. He's a professor at Columbia. Everyone in our business knows that he chews like 5 or 6 pieces of Nicorette a day because when he was a smoker, nicotine is an amazing nootropic.
Love.
But the delivery device will kill you. Vaping's not good for you. Smoking's not good for you. Dipping's not good for you. Snuffing's not good for you. In Scandinavia, they use the little Zyn pouches.
Yeah.
Look, I'm not going to push nicotine on people, but the reason I take alpha GPC to work every once in a while is because it stimulates nicotine release and you can focus like a laser. And I don't need it, but I do enjoy it every once in a while. And it's safe-ish for me. Obviously people have to decide what's safe for them. But, nicotine focuses the brain in an incredible way. Yeah. Adderall, the problem is it's very addictive because there's nothing like that narrow tunnel of focus that you get from Adderall.
It's like the limitless drug. I took a full at Burning Man.
Yeah.
But I didn't feel that as much. But I've heard if you got work to do, it's fucking, it's done.
Yeah, you're in the tunnel. And so it becomes so there's use, there's dependency, and then there's addiction, right? And addiction I define, and this is based on the biology of it, but we don't have to get into that right now because we've done long episodes of that. Some of the episodes of my podcast are so long, they're like going to cure insomnia for sure. But addiction in my mind is, as the biology says, it's a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you pleasure. And it's also a progressive narrowing of the things that bring you the effect you want. It's like the fetish thing, right? Are you addicted to boots? Boots is the other one, right? Like some people have a boot fetish.
No. Yeah. Take the boot off, sock off.
Yeah, he likes the feet. You need the boot off unless there's a little window, one toe showing.
I like
Andrew's there.
Yep.
But if you need Adderall in order to focus, you're becoming dependent. Are you addicted? Well, I don't know. It depends. But yesterday I ran into a guy on the street and we were talking about this and he said he's off Adderall now, but he has to go to AA and NA meetings in order to stay sober. So that tells me he's, this is serious.
Yeah.
And, I think that the current estimate is that more than 80% of college students take Adderall, Vyvanse, or, Ritalin at some point. So it's amphetamine. And if people are struggling with it, one incentive to get off of it is that it's not good for your heart. It tends to push all the blood towards sort of core organs. It's like stress response. Because when you're stressed, your pupils get big and your vision gets like, this narrow. That's why they put blinders on horses. so that they don't look around and focus on other things. I mean, it'll shrink the penis, you know, not permanently, but it causes vasoconstriction, right? It's the opposite of things that cause vasodilation.
So you've never taken Adderall.
I've never taken Adderall, never taken Vyvanse. I took,
I know.
I tried armodafinil once. I got a prescription for armodafinil, and I took it, and I had to give a lecture that day, and I couldn't stop lecturing. It was a problem for me anyway, but I just was just so in the tunnel. I didn't like it. It gave me a brutal headache. I don't think I'd ever do it again. But I like caffeine. I think healthy use. Yeah. Caffeine's amazing. It's amazing that nicotine has its place for certain people. Nicotine is protective against Parkinson's. Yeah, it has neuroprotective effects. But I don't think people should be smoking, dipping, vaping, and snuffing. And nobody snuffs anymore. Snuff, I think, is they literally put the tobacco up the nose. Yeah.
How much caffeine is too much caffeine? Is there an amount?
Oh, I did too much.
You know, if you spread it out, the amount that doesn't let you sleep, the timing counts there too. And nowadays they put theanine in energy drinks because it takes the jitters off, which allows you to drink more rocks. You know, I'm not going to name brands, but more energy drink.
That's not a bad thing, theanine in and of itself.
No, theanine's great in and of itself. Yeah, theanine's great. And you know, for sleep, magnesium threonate, theanine, apigenin, inositol, those things work well. I'd rather see people use supplements like that than rely heavily on melatonin, Ambien, you know, and any barbiturates. Okay, but you're drinking. Yeah. You want to drink. So let me just ask you this. So in order to be happy at this stage of your life, how many drinks do you need per week? One beer, wine, or one cocktail each representing one? And just, you know.
Like I didn't drink for 10 years. I don't need, like when I was in Santa Barbara, I didn't drink. Yeah. So like.
Wait, really?
Yeah. I mean, I drank maybe like the first 2 years. By the time it was legal for me to drink, I didn't drink.
Then you became a pothead in Europe.
Yeah. And
you might have been the one
we first
person
met
in Isla Vista that didn't drink.
Yeah. I don't drink. When we first met, he didn't drink. He didn't smoke weed. He didn't do anything.
Yeah.
For years.
What were you into?
Nothing.
Surfing and
comedy.
That's where you picked up comedy.
Yeah, feet. Yeah, no.
Where did you do comedy?
I did comedy in Santa Barbara for the first time.
Where? There's
a restaurant there called Bricks Cafe that I was managing, and yeah, they had a comedy night, and I just tried it out. And I did it when I got back. But yeah, so it's like I can not drink very easily, though I do like drinking, and I think it's fun. I think it's cool. I think it's it's a quick disassociation. I actually prefer weed, but I just get such a hangover from it the next day. Like I get like really affected by it. Makes me like really insecure and anxious the next day.
Well, cannabis, so just briefly, like cannabis is a mixture of THC and CBD. And then I did an episode on this, and nowadays, you know, there's more THC in some of them and some CBD. And the cannabis can be of the sativa type or the indica type. Indica tends to be in general, and the pot smokers always come after me about this, but in general, they call it like indica, like Inda couch.
Yeah, that's
right. It's like a mellows you, and sativa is kind of more elevating. Depends. And then there's this whole world of terpenes, which are like the things that give it like a citrusy, taste-ish smell. Terpenes are plant-based compounds, and like now you get these. Like it's amazing how cannabis. People who love cannabis, they're like, no, you got to talk about the terpenes, and you're not, you know. So you don't want to use blanket statements with cannabis because it does have its uses for glaucoma. There's a pure CBD form of marijuana that is only available in Colorado called Charlotte's Web that parents actually move there if their kids have certain forms of psychosis and epilepsy. This doesn't get them high, but seems to help. So I'm not one of these people that says cannabis is bad. It has certain medical purposes. However, high THC cannabis that's vaped in particular, because it hits the bloodstream and brain so fast. And if that's used in young people, for young people that have a predisposition to bipolar or schizophrenia, it can trigger psychosis later in life. Wow. And then, you know, I put this out on the internet in a podcast, and boy, did I get attacked. I was like, listen, I'm not saying cannabis is bad, right? I'm basically a live and let live kind of type, as long as people aren't harming other people. You know, for the most part, you know, I'm not one to tell people what to do. I'm not a cop, but or a politician. But I think if people have tendencies toward bipolar, smoking very high THC cannabis is really risky. And that's just what we've seen over and over again. There's these huge data sets out of Canada that show this. And again, I'm not trying to shut down the cannabis industry. I think it's really interesting what's happened. People always say, well, is cannabis safer than alcohol? And I always say, who cares? Like, if you really want to do cannabis, you're going to do it, right? Let's just be realistic. Is it safer? Well, yeah, for driving, maybe. But if it's very high THC, maybe not. And so you kind of get into these arguments that don't really make sense.
What is very high THC? Sorry.
It's the percentage, it's going to be the ratio of CBD. So when you start getting past like 50-50 ratios, and like, and you can buy pure THC now. People are vaping pure THC.
Oh, yeah.
I mean, which is, you know, and if you have a stable mental constitution, you're healthy in other ways, maybe it's fine.
And with what frequency of vaping would it cause?
So that's interesting. Again, that gets into the realm of what psychologists would call adaptive maladaptive behavior. So if you, for instance, can't function in your work, it's too much.
Right.
But there are people who are in creative endeavors or even programmers who do really well smoking, you know, 2 or 3 times a day. And so I'm not going to be the one who says, don't do it. You know, the drugs we talked about before, you know, cocaine, amphetamine, heroin, those you kind of put into a bin of like bad, right? Just can't be good, right? No one thrives on those, right? And many people destroy their lives with them.
But in terms of triggering psychosis, with what frequency from those Canadian studies?
So you do see that the more high THC cannabis that people smoke, the higher probability they're going to have a psychotic episode later.
Even if it was
But
just a couple of times they smoked.
that seems pretty unlikely. That seems pretty unlikely.
They have to
Now,
be smoking
methamphetamine only
high
takes one or
frequency.
two uses to trigger a psychotic episode. I have
Absolutely.
a friend from high school who was always a little weird. His
Yeah.
whole family was kind of weird because these things run in families. And he did amphetamine. It wasn't meth. He did amphetamine 1 or 2 times, and he's still walking the streets of San Francisco. He's like a homeless guy who's crazy. He's crazy.
Is there
you
any
know.
way to fix
It's
that?
sad.
Or reverse that?
Sometimes people can take these drugs, antipsychotics, but the problem is those antipsychotic drugs usually block dopamine, and people don't like to have their dopamine blocked.
Yeah.
In fact, if you ever see a homeless person who's on the street doing this kind of writhing thing, there are 2 versions of that. One is there's the meth addict version of that, the walk,
Yeah.
right? The meth walk.
Really
And
good
then
at
there's the schizophrenics who are taking their psychotic medication, will get something called tardive dyskinesia. Parkinson's is loss of dopamine. When they take antipsychotic medication, they're blocking dopamine. You get Parkinson's-like things where
interesting.
movement gets messed up. Cannabis, look, I think cannabis, again, has its medical applications. Certainly, stimulating appetite for cancer patients, glaucoma in some cases. If I had a magic wand, I'd say, hey, kids, let your brain develop. And then explore if you're going to explore. Same thing with psychedelics.
Yeah.
MDMA is an interesting drug we could talk about. There are a lot of data on that.
What about mushrooms?
Yeah,
Yeah.
I'm 38, and then I just found out weed is fun and mushrooms sound fun too. Never touched it before.
Either
Never did anything.
or alcohol.
I was a fucking dork. I've been buzzed twice, and then alcohol to me was always worse than weed.
You don't
'cause it's
even need the
collateral.
X's, the straight edge thing, tattooed on your hands, right?
Bruh, no,
When I was
that's
growing up, it was like
who gets-
Mushrooms, though.
mushrooms. Okay, so psilocybin. So there are clinical trials showing that macro dose psilocybin. So we're talking massive dose that puts people into a highly hallucinogenic state.
How many grams is that?
We're talking like 2 to anywhere like 1 to 5
Dove
grams.
loves mushrooms.
Yeah, so it's interesting. They stimulate high release of serotonin, among other things. But there's work by Matthew Johnson at Johns Hopkins and work now at UCSF by Robin Carter Harris showing that psilocybin at the macro dose used once or twice in a therapeutic setting can really help people move through depression and trauma and maybe even eating disorders and maybe some other things too.
Wow.
It seems to create some sort of opportunity for learning new relationships between things. Like if you're somebody who's always felt like you were going to fail in life or you couldn't get over a loss or a death or a relationship, like it does allow people somehow to imagine new possibilities. In fact, 66% of people that in those trials found lasting relief years or more from psilocybin. Now that doesn't mean go crazy recreational psilocybin. Also, I'm just citing what Matthew Johnson, who's like the leader, one of the leaders in this field, told me. I was like, what about microdosing? And
I was gonna ask.
And he said, he said, very little evidence. Maybe it's because the studies aren't done yet, but at least to my knowledge, very little evidence. He said macrodosing. So that was kind of surprising.
That's surprising. I hear about people doing like 0.2 over the course of a couple week
Yep.
period,
Just
to
a
see
little
some
bit.
type of new flow.
Yeah. Psilocybin is because it's very serotonergic, it tends to be kind of mossy, earthy. People hallucinate. It's kind of a mellow. People talk about ego dissolution, kind of allows you to see yourself through different perspectives, work through things. Then there's, of course, MDMA. Now, psilocybin is generally considered safe for adults in the clinical setting. The safety profiles are very, very high. But this isn't the kind of thing you want to take and then go, and then go for a drive, obviously.
Yeah,
you need some limits in place. And there was a case in Florida not that long ago where a guy walked up to a family sitting having lunch and killed them and then sat down on the ground and they found out, he was high on psilocybin. Now, did he have violent tendencies before? Who knows? But, and it happens. And that's one case, right? And how many people did that on alcohol or didn't even require
So
a
it's
drug?
almost
You have
like
to be careful with these
You
examples.
probably need to be guided. Like I've heard there's a type of therapy where they will give
Yes.
you shrooms and the guy will guide you through it. Is that the way to do it?
If people are going to explore this, I highly recommend doing it with a trained licensed clinician. And these are moving towards legalization. Currently, they're still illegal, right? But they're decriminalized in a lot of places, which is different than being legal. And then there's this question of like how often, right? And there isn't a really good answer for that, but if you're macrodosing psilocybin, you can't really do it that often.
Yeah.
I mean, you're booking the weekend. And then there's the integration. Remember, what happens during the session is one thing, but that window of neuroplasticity, the ability to change your brain, goes on for weeks and weeks and weeks. So it may not be just about the experience. It's also about what happens in the wake of that experience. But they're very exciting drugs, frankly, and psychiatrists who are progressive, and we have several of them at Stanford, are really interested in this. There's DMT, there's Ibogaine, and we could talk about it for hours.
What about ayahuasca? What is actually happening?
Oh, that's great.
So that's a DMT experience. So this is, it's amazing. 2 plants that you have to combine in order to get this. It's a massive shift in space and time recognition. Ayahuasca is a bit more of a complicated interpretation, like as to whether or not it's safe. It tends to bring up a lot of heavy issues.
But what is happening, like actually in your brain?
Oh,
What are
massive
those
release of
drugs?
serotonin and DMT, dimethyltryptamine.
Yeah.
So it's a very I don't want, again, the psychonaut's going to jump all over me for this, but it has some very like LSD-like qualities, some very psilocybin-like qualities.
Yeah.
Tends to distort your notions of space and time. DMT itself is is like a freight train, only lasts about 15 minutes.
But what are these like gnomes that people say that they see?
Yeah. The green men.
The green men.
Yeah, there's some things that people tend to see, but the same way that like if people take LSD, you see tracers, right? It disrupts your visual perception, so your motion perception is off. That's because all these chemicals are used all over the brain. I'll be honest. I mean, I think that there are less data on ayahuasca. Psilocybin's being tested, and MDMA, the data on MDMA are incredible. And MDMA is this massive increase in serotonin, but also dopamine. And the thing about MDMA is for years it was thought that it is neurotoxic. And that's because a paper was published on this. It turns out they were using methamphetamine, not MDMA in these studies. The safety profiles of MDMA, provided it's real MDMA, it's not cut with methamphetamine, are actually quite high. This was discussed by a guy named Nolan Williams, who's in our department of psychiatry at Stanford. He's one of these crazy, like triple board certified psychiatrist twice over and neurologist. So you gotta trust him. He's very, very conservative about this stuff.
Pure MDMA.
Pure MDMA has been tested at minimal use, meaning just a couple of times, moderate use, which is I think like 5 to 10 times or so, and then people have used a lot of it. And the safety profiles showed that people tend to be cognitively normal despite those uses. But the sourcing matters.